The Jamaican government recently announced that they will not be renewing the JPS contract in its current form, which opens the door to quite a few possibilities. One of which is having the government buy out the entire company. JPS currently controls 97% of Jamaica's power supply. They have around 700,000 customers and currently charges about 36 cents per kilowatt hours, which means Jamaica has one of the highest electricity rates in the entire world. Now, to figure out how JPS was allowed to control the country's electricity, we have to go back in the past. Jamaica was actually one of the first countries in the world to get electricity. In 1892, just 13 years after Thomas Edison perfected the light bulb, the Jamaica Electric Light Company started supplying power from a small coal-burning plant on Gold Street in Kingston. Back then, Jamaica had several different power companies competing against each other for customers. Fast forward to 1923, and these companies started merging together, and after a couple merges, they eventually became the Jamaica Public Service Company. At this point, they had around 3,928 customers, but they wanted more. So over time, they aggressively started buying out their competition and merged it with the company. They continued buying and merging, until by 1945, JPS had basically eliminated all of their competition and became Jamaica's dominant power company. This was then made official by 1966 when the Jamaican government granted JPS the first all-island electric license, essentially giving them a formal monopoly over electricity in Jamaica. Then in 1970, the government decided to nationalize JPS and run the company themselves for around 31 years, until 2001 when the government privatized the company again. They sold 80% to Mirant Corporation and kept only 19% for themselves, which the government still owns today. Since then, JPS has changed hands twice. In 2017, Japan's Marubeni Corporation bought out Mirant. Then in 2011, Korea East-West Power joined Marubeni as co-owners. So 40% of JPS is owned by Marubeni, another 40% is owned by Korea East-West Power, 19% by the Jamaican government, and a small 1% by private shareholders. Now back to the present. Let's say the current fair market valuation for the company is $2 billion US. However, since the government already owns 19% of the company, this means they would only need to buy out 81% from the other shareholders. So that means the government would only have to pay $1.6 billion US for the utility company, and that's a huge problem. To put this into perspective, the country's yearly budget is 1.3 trillion Jamaican dollars or 8.4 billion US. This means that the country would have to use 19% of its entire budget in order to purchase JPS. Now, given the fact that 37% already goes towards the current debt payments, if we should subtract these two figures, this would only leave the country with 44% or 3.7 billion US to spend on itself. Literally less than half of the island's entire budget. So it's probably safe to assume that the government would not be able to fund this themselves, which means they would need to get the funds from somewhere else, and there are quite a few options. The first one is borrowing. The government could borrow from the International Monetary Fund for this major acquisition. China also offers another potential source of financial loan, and Middle Eastern countries might also provide necessary funding for this operation. The issue with this, though, is that Jamaica spent years reducing its national debt. So taking on $1.6 billion in new debt would instantly reverse years of progress, and the public would not be a fan of this option. The second option would be to use the country's $5.8 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Now, if you don't know what this is, let me explain. A foreign exchange reserve is the money the government keeps in foreign currency like the US dollar. These reserves are used to protect the Jamaican dollar from falling in value. The Bank of Jamaica keeps this money to buy Jamaican dollars when necessary. This is to help keep the exchange rate stable for everyone. Now, taking $1.6 billion from the reserve would reduce it by 28%, and this would put the country into a terrible position since the island is prone to economic shocks like earthquakes, hurricanes, or global market disruptions. And we also don't want to develop the habit of dipping into the reserve whenever we have a financial issue we need to resolve. So that option is off the table. The third option is using the Jamaica Stock Exchange to raise funds through a public share offering. In this case, the government could do an IPO of the company's shares and allow the public to buy into the company and use this as a method to raise the amount required to buy out the other shareholders. But we still haven't answered a very important question. Who would be running the company itself? Many persons are not a fan of the government running the company because of fear that it would become inefficient and would end up in an even worse scenario than it is now. However, the government doesn't have to take over the company. We do have quite a few options. The first one is that the government could just renegotiate the current license. The new conditions might include things like pricing caps, minimum service standards, and mandatory infrastructure investments. The good thing with this approach is that it would cost the government almost nothing, and JPS stays in place under tighter rules. The downside with this, however, is that the company would still be in control of everything. And I don't think the public would be a fan of this option. Another option could be breaking JPS up into multiple different smaller companies and make it so that customers can switch to another company whenever they feel that the one they're using is charging them too much. This would encourage real competition. Companies would need to actually earn your business by offering better service or lower prices. But electricity isn't like a phone plan. It's hard and expensive to duplicate infrastructure, and it could cause confusion, uneven service, and leave some areas, especially rural ones, behind. A third option is to allow another company to completely take over JPS operations instead. This would bring fresh leadership, new systems, and possibly better customer service.